The main reason why I decided to major in philosophy is simply because I think I find that subject very fascinating. Like, I don't think any other subject, asks so many questions about the things that we think is just ordinary. Like, almost ridiculous questions like, do I have hands? Like, no one asks that, right? It's so bizarre to even think about it. And I think a lot of people will be like, okay, that's trivial, Of course we have hands. But I think it's the same idea that someone decided to ask why did the apple fall and then discovered gravity. So I think it's in that same vein that I think that when we really try to push forward our questioning, even to the most trivial or smallest things that we never think about, that's where really interesting answers and really interesting things come out. So that's I think why I just feel really drawn to philosophy. Right, so I think one of the most exciting things about philosophy are actually thought experiments. And they're basically ideas or concepts brought to you in a way that is very simple, very accessible, so that anyone could just imagine yourself in the experiments shoes. So one such experiment that really blew my mind when I first heard it was basically this thought experiment by David Hume. It was on the problem of induction, which in another way put it is just about how we make inferences. And then using our inferences, we assume certain things to be laws of nature. So that thought experiment simply goes by saying that, okay, imagine yourself to be a chicken, right? And a chicken would see that every time a human comes by, it means that food comes. And they think, okay, that might be the law of nature, right? The human always brings food. And we can compare that to the things that we assume to be true all the time, which is that the sun rises and it happens to always rise in the east, for example. And one day, the chicken realizes, well, the chicken doesn't realize, but the chicken eventually gets slaughtered by the very man that's supposed to bring in food. And that's when a supposed law, gets overthrown. And I think that can be drawn to how we might think about the sun rising. We think that, well, of course the sun always rises in the east, but you never know. You never know if one day that doesn't happen anymore. Because what we assume to be law of nature is simply inferences. I think that's a crazy thought, and that's very exciting to think about, right? About how many other beliefs you might have that are also might be equivalent to a chicken thinking, right? So that's very interesting, and that's something I think I do philosophy to find out about. The main adaptation to university is really about the amount of freedom that university gives its students. So you don't have a very strict timetable from the morning to evening. You get to choose your classes, you choose when they happen, especially as a FASS student, because you get even more freedom to explore different modules. So it's definitely one of the key things I adapted to. I think I adapted to it well because I love that freedom. I like to be able to arrange my schedule. And the most important thing of that, I think, is with freedom comes a lot of power and needing to prioritize, right? So I think that by prioritizing and by making sure that you know what you care about, making sure you have time for your activities beyond studying, like CCAs, residential colleges, hall activities, I think that's the main thing to adapt to, and it can be very, very fulfilling. Frankly speaking, I don't have very concrete plans after graduation because I really believe in exploration. And I think that as a student of philosophy, I try to break the conventions and the boundaries of what we might think that is okay or not, or things that you might usually not ask about or question. So in that same vein, I think I don't want to limit our options to what, let's say, a typical philosophy student might do, which honestly there isn't one. But for me, I plan to explore my hobbies like woodworking, completely unrelated, but I love it, so I'm going to do it and see what I can do with it. And if anything else arises, then I'll explore that. I think that there's that kind of freedom in that as well, and eventually I'll settle on something that I really enjoy and then pursue it further. I think that's my plan after graduation. So definitely one of the most known and definitely true reasons is about the critical thinking that philosophy teaches you or trains you in. So rather than becoming very knowledgeable in a specific subject, maybe let's say if you're a science student, physics let's say, philosophy doesn't really do that because let's say an example of whether or not inference is true, whether we have hands, aren't going to do much for you in let's say a future career or employment. But what it's going to do is to teach you to think, right? And that's as fundamental as it gets. So I think that's really helpful. But more than that, I think it gives you a lot of courage to ask questions that no one else might ask. And that builds initiative and all the other soft skills that follow from that. So I think that's extremely helpful to be a philosophy student, that when you tell someone what your key skill is I can think smart, I can think critically, I can ask questions. I think that's super good. Yeah. I personally think that interdisciplinary learning is really important, and what it does, it helps us break down complex issues, right? Because a lot of things aren't so black and white anymore. We can't just look at it from, let's say, a philosophical perspective even, right? We look at it from psychological perspectives, we look at it from geographical perspectives to really understand an issue in a deeper way, and to put it simply, a more complex way. Yeah, and I think that is really helpful when it comes to any career really, right? Because looking at things in a more interdisciplinary way also gives rise to better solutions, right? More holistic solutions. So I think that is the value of interdisciplinary learning, and I personally try to pursue it the best I can. So even though I'm a philosophy major, I did spend the first 2 years of my undergraduate making full use of the FASS Life Freedom to try different modules. I played around with like political science, got a bit about geography, just to get a feel for as much as I can, right, until I used up all my unrestricted electives. But with that, I think a good counterpoint or just a consideration is that while interdisciplinary learning is really important, overemphasis could also be counterproductive, right? Because it becomes more like a dilution of like the kind of knowledge that we might have in a specific field, which is also what gives that kind of valuable input beyond like a surface level understanding. So as important interdisciplinary learning is, I think it's really important to have flexibility for students to know how deep they want to go in a subject and then how broad they want to expand to other disciplines. So I think that there's like some sort of sweet spot where you balance both interdisciplinary learning and specialization. Yeah. I think that I touched on that briefly in some of the earlier answers, which is that I think it's really interesting that FASS offers 2 years for you to explore modules, to just try to get exposure. And in fact, if I'm not wrong, it's a requirement to get exposure into different baskets, which they call, of fields in the arts and social sciences. I think that's really interesting because I know for a fact that I came in here thinking that I'll be a political science student. But as things will have it, I'm a philosophy student now. And I would imagine that it would have been really difficult for me if I didn't have a chance to try out philosophy students, because I think what happens in perhaps other universities where you have to choose a major from the get-go is that they might realize they don't like the major that they enrolled in for, and then have to change course later on midway in their study, which does forfeit quite a bit of time. It can be quite a pity, and it's often a very difficult decision to make. I wouldn't know how I would have chosen political science over philosophy if I had already spent, let's say, 2 years into political science. So having that freedom in the beginning to explore and then make an informed choice is very important to me. I think that is one of the unique benefits that I find really interesting and helpful at FASS.